Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
When my mom told me, "Please don't overshadow your brother's big day," I nodded. Not because I agreed. Not because I felt generous or noble or somehow moved by her trembling voice and dramatic sighs, but because I had learned over the years that nodding and keeping my mouth shut was often the path of least resistance in a family where silence was the currency of peace and emotional blackmail wore a face of maternal concern. She said it over the phone, but I could still see her. The way she furrowed her brow just enough to appear pained, but not so much to crease her Botox. How she would close her eyes and inhale sharply, as if simply breathing in my presence. My life choices, my existence, was burdensome. I let her finish the monologue she clearly rehearsed. "Just let him have this. He's finally settling down. This is a big deal. Don't bring any of your career stuff or whatever's going on with you. You know how he gets." Oh, I know exactly how Jason gets. Jason, the golden boy, with the curated Instagram and the car dealership he barely runs, but always brags about. Jason, who got a standing ovation for finishing community college after 4 years of hard effort. And I say that with every ounce of sarcasm it deserves. While I graduated top of my class at Northwestern, with not so much as a lukewarm congratulations dinner. Jason, who somehow managed to break mom's favorite lamp as a kid, lie about it, blame me, and still get a new PlayStation the following week. But here's the thing. I didn't nod because I agreed. I nodded because I knew something she didn't. I knew that this engagement dinner, this big moment she was so desperate to protect, was built on sand, and the tide was coming in fast. Still, I didn't say a word. Instead, I agreed to wear something understated to the dinner, her words, and not mention the award I had just won at the industry gala in Chicago, where I gave a speech about women in tech that got picked up by 3 national outlets. I tucked the plaque into a drawer. I even declined a live podcast interview that would have conflicted with the dinner because, apparently, Rachel's family is flying in, and it would be rude not to be there. Jason's fiancée, Rachel, seemed nice enough when I first met her. One of those women who has mastered the art of being both agreeable and unreadable, someone who complimented my earrings, but never made eye contact long enough for the compliment to land. I pegged her as sweet, a bit reserved, maybe a little too into Pinterest. But there was something else too, a sharpness beneath the smiles, something steel-edged. I noticed it the second time we met, when she asked me quietly, "So what's your brother really like?" It wasn't a joking question, and she didn't laugh afterward. That was 6 months ago. Back to the present, the week of the engagement dinner, I started noticing that the group chat my mother set up, the big day, with 3 exclamation points, had grown oddly quiet. Not for me, of course. She sent me messages daily. Reminders of the dress code, suggestions for safe conversation topics, thinly veiled warnings about making everything about myself. Just please don't talk politics or religion or, Lena things. I almost asked her to define Lena things, but I knew better. That would open a door neither of us wanted to walk through. Meanwhile, Jason wasn't replying at all. Not to me, not even to Mom. She brushed it off as pre-engagement nerves, as if that explained the missed calls, the late replies, and his vague posts about loyalty and starting over. Something was off, but again, I kept my mouth shut. I had learned long ago that speaking truth in this family didn't earn you respect. It earned you silence, withdrawal, and guilt trips disguised as dinner invitations. What really stuck in my throat, though, was the way Mom phrased her plea. Let him have his moment. As if moments were finite. As if my existence threatened his oxygen. As if by simply showing up as who I am, a successful woman who didn't need to be rescued or coddled or defended, I was somehow stealing from him. I thought of all the moments I let him have. The childhood spelling bee where I came in first, and he cried because he didn't place, so I gave him my ribbon. The high school talent show I dropped out of because he was afraid I'd outshine him in front of his crush. The college graduation where I kept my acceptance letter to MIT to myself because he had just lost a summer internship, and Mom said he was fragile. Decades of invisible sacrifices, all to let him have his damn moment. And now here we were again, Jason's big day. Rachel's family flying in. I was told to be pleasant, to smile, to sit back and let the evening unfold like a pageant I was not meant to win. I agreed to all of it, even to bringing a neutral-looking gift, no bows, no card that could imply sentimentality or sarcasm. But what Mom didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a week ago, I had lunch with someone who had a voicemail, someone who told me something I had long suspected but never had proof of, someone who had Rachel's ear. I listened. I asked questions. I smiled politely. And then I thanked her. Because when someone hands you a lit match and points to the fuse, you don't argue. You wait. So I waited. I nodded. I said nothing. I let him have his moment. But I knew, deep down in the pit of my stomach, in that bitter place where old wounds fester, that this dinner would not end the way they imagined. Not because I planned anything explosive, but because the truth, once spoken, doesn't ask permission. And when that truth finally arrived, it wouldn't come from me. That was the best part. I wouldn't have to raise my voice. I wouldn't even have to stand. I'd just sit there, sipping my wine, while the entire room fell silent. And Jason's perfect moment shattered under the weight of his own voice. If I could describe my family dynamic in one sentence, it would be this. Jason made the mess, and I cleaned it up quietly, without acknowledgement, without applause, without so much as a thank you whispered behind closed doors. And over time, that pattern became so deeply embedded in our rituals, in our conversations, in our very bones, that even when the mess wasn't mine to clean, everyone still turned and looked at me, as if by birthright or divine assignment, I owed the family its balance, its silence, its dignity. I remember the first time I truly noticed it. I was 12, Jason had taken my bike without asking and returned it mangled, tire bent, chain snapped, the handlebars wrapped in someone else's chewing gum. And when I came crying into the kitchen, expecting outrage or justice, or at the very least a refund, Mom looked up from her crossword puzzle, sighed like I had just announced I'd failed algebra, and said, "Sweetheart, you're older, you need to be more understanding, he's sensitive, he meant well." That sentence stuck with me the way old gum sticks to shoe soles, persistent, sticky, unshakable. Jason meant well. Jason was trying. Jason's heart was in the right place. Jason didn't mean to cheat, didn't mean to lie, didn't mean to screw up, but I always meant to disappoint. This is the lens I carry with me into every family event, and the engagement dinner was no different. The week leading up to it was its own theater of subtle cruelties and passive-aggressive pageantry. The family group chat, originally called Taylor Thanksgiving, but now renamed The Big Day in an effort to project excitement, had grown strangely quiet, at least from my end of the screen. Not that the messages stopped entirely. Mom was still firing off updates like a wedding planner on Adderall. Table runner colors finalized? Rachel's mom bringing the roasted squash. Jason wants his seat to face the window for lighting. But what changed, and not subtly, was the sudden appearance of sub-chats, conversations I wasn't part of, logistics handled without my input, jokes I didn't understand, references I hadn't seen. It was like watching a play where I was supposed to be a supporting character, but no one gave me the script. When I asked about it casually during a call with my dad, one of those awkward short check-ins where he sounded like he was holding the phone 2 feet from his mouth and possibly reading the TV subtitles at the same time, he paused for a second too long and said, "Oh, huh, maybe the app's buggy." And that was that. No follow-up, no concern, just a silent confirmation that, once again, I was orbiting a family that never quite knew what to do with me. The irony is, I had always shown up. I was the one who bought Dad that Bluetooth grill thermometer he still uses. I was the one who hand-lettered the place cards for Jason's high school graduation dinner when Rachel was just some blurry girl in a profile picture. I was the one who booked Mom's spa day when her migraines flared up last summer. I was always there, dependable, overprepared, slightly underdressed because I didn't believe in spending $200 on a blouse, when my car still had a mystery rattle. But still, I was always the one they looked through rather than at. Jason, meanwhile, had gone suspiciously silent. While Rachel posted almost daily about love, about building a future, about choosing joy, Jason hadn't posted in over a week. And the last thing he'd shared was a black and white photo of a whiskey glass with a single melting cube and the caption, "Some things are harder than they look," which, in Jason speak, could mean anything from a hangover to cheating on your fiancé to forgetting how to boil pasta. The man has never been burdened by the need to communicate with clarity. Mom, of course, waved off any concerns. "He's just overwhelmed," she said, stirring something aggressively in a pan when I stopped by earlier that week. "He's never been great with expressing himself. Not like you, always talking and thinking and analyzing. Just let him be. This is his time. You had your time in, what was it, March? The tech thing?" She couldn't remember the name of the national award I'd received for leading a project that improved emergency response software in 5 major cities. But she could recite, word for word, the speech Jason gave to his dealership staff about next quarter growth mindset at last year's Christmas party. And the thing is, and I hate admitting this even to myself, I didn't want to blow things up. Not yet. I wasn't eager for chaos. I wasn't looking to ruin Jason's life. I wanted for once to be the adult in the room who didn't let her bitterness spoil the party, to be the older sister who smiled at the engagement and handed over the salad tongs and said nothing. But when you're sitting at the edge of something fragile, and believe me, Rachel and Jason's relationship was made of glass, no matter how many smiling photos she posted. It doesn't take much more than a hairline crack to make everything shatter. And I knew there was a crack. I had seen it. Or rather, I had heard it. The voicemail, the voice, the name that wasn't Rachel's. I hadn't told anyone I had it, not even Rachel, though I suspected she had her own version. The way she looked at me during our last brief coffee meetup, the way she paused when I mentioned trust. It wasn't the look of a woman unaware. It was the look of a woman holding a grenade behind her back, waiting to see who else had one too. So I kept quiet. I muted the group chat. I RSVP'd to the dinner. I even offered to bring wine, which Mom quickly declined, saying she'd already coordinated a very curated beverage selection with Rachel's dad, who I'm sure hasn't tasted anything that didn't come in a golf course tumbler since the Clinton administration. I put on the smile. I wore the beige. I let them believe I was neutral, but every hour that passed felt like it was bringing us closer, not to a celebration but to a fault line, a moment where all the tension they never addressed, all the favoritism they never owned, and all the resentment I swallowed like broken glass would finally rupture. And I would be there. I would be sitting at the table. I would be quiet. But I would not be kind. Not this time. There's something uniquely cruel about walking into a room full of people who smile like they've missed you while simultaneously rearranging themselves in subtle ways to make sure you know you were never supposed to be at the center of it. As if your presence is merely a tolerated footnote in a story that's already been written without you. And that's exactly how it felt stepping through the double doors of the rented event space that evening, where pastel tablecloths and overly eager hors d'oeuvres servers tried to mask a tension thick enough to chew. The room, bathed in a honey-colored light that made everyone look 5 years younger and 2 pay grades wealthier, had been set up with precision, white folding chairs with gold ribbons, a handmade banner that read, "Jason and Rachel Forever," in cursive so flowery, I almost asked if it had been printed by a florist, and a makeshift stage where I assumed, correctly, that at least one speech would be delivered by someone whose voice was too loud and thoughts too small. Mom greeted me first, all forced warmth and overextended hugs, her perfume like nostalgia soaked in citrus and disappointment. She took one look at my dress, black, elegant, simple, and frowned so slightly it could have passed as a facial twitch, then quickly complimented my hair with the tone of someone trying to pivot after stepping in something unpleasant. "I'm glad you came," she said, her hands lingering on my shoulders longer than necessary. "Just, let's try to keep it light tonight, okay? Light. Like I was a dimmer switch they could lower when I became inconvenient. like my presence was too bright, too sharp, too much to fit into the delicate aesthetic of Jason's perfect evening. I gave her the smile I'd practiced in the mirror for years, tight-lipped, polite, unreadable, and stepped past her toward the crowd, where Jason stood in the center like a sculpture everyone was pretending not to be admiring too obviously. He wore a navy blazer, no tie, hair gelled with the kind of confidence only the undeservedly adored seem to cultivate. And when he saw me, his smile flickered for just a second before stretching wide and hollow. "Lena," he said, arms open like a man greeting a cousin he once pushed down a flight of stairs, but now owed civility. "You made it." "I said I would," I replied, letting him hug me, firm, 2 pats on the back, a performance for anyone watching. He smelled like whiskey and wood polish, and for a second, I wondered how many drinks he'd had already, then decided it didn't matter. Rachel appeared at his side, practically gliding in a pale green dress that looked expensive but effortless, her hair coiled into a low bun that made her seem even more composed than usual. She kissed my cheek, told me she was so happy I came. And I believed her, but not in the way most people might expect. Not as a statement of warmth, but as a signal, a quiet confirmation that something was unfolding behind her eyes, something deliberate. The evening unspooled like a film someone had already edited, laughter where there should have been questions, applause at stories I knew were half true, and speeches layered with nostalgia so thick it drowned out any room for accuracy. Jason's best friend, some guy I vaguely remembered from high school, who once tried to kiss me at a 4th of July party behind the tool shed, gave a toast that referenced Jason's loyalty and sense of commitment, and I almost choked on my wine. My father, seated next to me in a charcoal gray suit he wore only twice a year, leaned over and said, "He turned out okay, didn't he?" With a note of pride so sincere it scraped the inside of my chest. I nodded, swallowing hard, the words too bitter to surface. But it wasn't until I stepped outside for air that I saw something I couldn't unsee. I wasn't sneaking out or storming away, just taking a breather from the curated family tableau, walking toward the edge of the patio where string lights swayed in the breeze like bored fireflies. I rounded the hedge-lined path and saw Jason, not alone, not looking solemn or reflective, not smoking a cigarette in silence like a groom-to-be, overwhelmed by the gravity of commitment. No, he was laughing, one hand gripping the hip of a woman in a crimson dress that was not Rachel's, his face close to hers, intimate in the way that comes only from repetition, from familiarity, from knowing exactly which jokes land and which touches ignite. She said something I couldn't hear, and he kissed her cheek, then her neck, and for a moment I wondered if maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was a cousin, a friend, a surprise guest with no understanding of boundaries. But then she turned, and I saw the same woman whose voicemail I'd heard, whose name he whispered like a guilty prayer. Marissa. I backed away before they saw me, heart thudding not from shock, because this didn't shock me, not really, but from the sheer weight of inevitability, the confirmation of what I'd suspected all along. Jason wasn't just flawed. He was calculated. He was the kind of man who lived 2 lives and convinced himself he deserved both. And now, standing just a wall away from his glowing fiancée and her beaming family, he was gambling it all for a woman who clearly wasn't just a mistake, but a choice. I went back inside. I smiled. I accepted another glass of wine. I listened as Rachel's father made a speech about legacy and faith and the sacred nature of commitment, and I watched Jason nod along, hands folded, gaze steady, as if the promises he was pretending to make that night had any weight left to them. I watched Rachel rest her hand on his, smile into his shoulder, and I wondered if she already knew or if she was about to find out. And if so, how? I didn't have to wait long, because near the end of the night, just before dessert, as the room began to buzz with the soft din of satisfied guests and oversugared champagne, Rachel turned to me with that same unreadable expression she'd worn at coffee all those months ago, and said, just loud enough for only me to hear, Do you think the playlist's too long? I shrugged. Good, she replied, pulling out her phone, fingers gliding over the screen. Because I want to add one more thing. And in that moment, I knew she wasn't talking about music. It was the kind of moment you feel coming in your bones long before it arrives. The sort that doesn't shout or stomp its way into a room, but rather tiptoes in behind the clinking of glasses, the soft laughter of satisfied guests, the distant echo of chairs shifting against hardwood floors. And by the time you recognize what's happening, it's already unfolding, deliberate, inevitable, and irreversible. Dessert had just been served. Tiny glass ramekins of something French-sounding with a burnt sugar crust that cracked too easily beneath silver spoons, and conversations that felt just as fragile. Jason, still glowing under the warm overhead lights and the attention he seemed to drink like wine, was seated beside Rachel, their chairs pushed slightly closer than everyone else's, their hands loosely clasped atop the table in a gesture that was more symbolic than affectionate, as if they had agreed to perform intimacy without necessarily feeling it. The speeches were winding down, the playlist, a curated blend of soft jazz and adult contemporary hits that felt chosen more for what they didn't say than for what they did, was lulling the room into the kind of pleasant haze that often follows too much sugar and not enough truth, and I was just beginning to consider slipping out early when Rachel's voice cut through the room with a clarity that silenced even the most committed small talkers. "Can I play something for you all?" She stood as she said it, not slowly and not nervously, but with the kind of calm decisiveness that comes only from knowing exactly what you're about to do and exactly how it will land. In her left hand, she held her wine glass. In her right, her phone, unlocked, screen already bright, thumb poised above the play icon, with a casualness so deliberate it felt like theater. The room shifted in its chairs and adjusted its posture the way people do when something unexpected demands their attention, but they're not quite ready to admit they're curious. Jason turned toward her slowly, his expression still pleasant but touched with confusion, the faint crease between his eyebrows forming like a shadow across sunlight, and Mom, who had been laughing softly at something Dad had mumbled under his breath, froze, her hand hovering midair, with a forkful of lemon tart she would never quite get to taste. Rachel's voice, when she continued, was gentle, polite, and unmistakably firm, the kind of voice people use when they're about to ruin the evening, but want you to know they did it with grace. "This won't take long," she said. "I just thought, since everyone has shared such beautiful stories about commitment, trust, and honesty tonight, it might be meaningful to share one more voice, someone who couldn't be here in person." Jason opened his mouth then, maybe to stop her, maybe to ask her to wait, maybe even to lie one last time with that easy charm he'd been using since we were kids. But Rachel pressed play before any sound could escape him, and what followed was not a song, not a poem, not a tribute. It was a voicemail. The audio came through loud and clear, thanks to the event's Bluetooth speakers, and for the first few seconds, people smiled, expecting perhaps a sweet message from a distant friend or a relative who couldn't travel. But the smile faded quickly, almost as if everyone in the room instinctively recognized the voice. Not because it was familiar, but because it was the kind of voice that carried with it the weight of guilt. "Hey, Marissa," the voice said, deep and unmistakably Jason's, lazy with affection in a way I had never heard him speak to Rachel. His tone soft and slow, the kind of intimate cadence that didn't belong in a room full of relatives and friends. "Last night was... God, I don't even know what to say. I've been thinking about you all day. Being with Rachel is like wearing someone else's shoes. They fit, but not right, you know? But you're bare feet on carpet. I don't even know what that means. I miss you already. Don't forget next Friday. Same hotel, room 305. The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It didn't fall like a glass breaking or a shout across a hallway. It was thick, oppressive, and somehow more painful in its stillness than any explosion could have been. People blinked, chairs creaked. A few gasps echoed quietly like tiny ripples in an otherwise undisturbed lake. Someone, I think it was Rachel's mother, whispered a sharp, panicked, "Oh my God," while Rachel stood calmly, her eyes scanning the room like a teacher checking to see if the class had understood the lesson. Jason sat frozen, mouth slightly open, as though his brain had not yet caught up to what his ears had just heard, his hands limp in his lap, no longer clasped with Rachel's, but awkwardly resting on the edge of the table like they had nowhere left to belong. Mom finally moved, standing up slowly as if unsure whether to run to Jason or scold Rachel or pretend none of it had happened. Her voice was tight when she spoke. That must be a misunderstanding, a prank, someone's idea of a joke. But Rachel, still composed, smiled in a way that suggested she had rehearsed this entire moment down to the breath and replied, "It's not a prank. I forwarded it to myself after he left it. I wasn't sure at first. I wanted to believe he was tired, distracted, maybe confused. But then I checked the hotel. He reserved it under his name. I spoke to the front desk. They confirmed. Room 305. No one said anything after that. No one moved. The weight of the truth hung over us like smoke. Acrid, clinging, impossible to escape. And then quietly, Rachel placed her wine glass on the table, turned to Jason, and said with exquisite softness, "I was going to wait until next month. I thought maybe we could work through it, but then I realized I don't want to spend the rest of my life making excuses for someone who doesn't even lie creatively." And with that, she walked away, slowly, elegantly, without tears or shouts or dramatics. Just a controlled grace that made her exit feel less like a breakup and more like a verdict. I remained seated, back straight, glass half full, heart racing, not with victory, but with a strange, hollow relief. This wasn't my moment. But I had let it happen. I had let the truth bloom in someone else's voice, on someone else's timeline. And I had watched it fall not like a bomb, but like the final snowflake that causes the avalanche. And still, I said nothing. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a public unraveling, not the polite hush of a room awaiting a toast or the breathless pause before a punchline, but a dense electric stillness that fills every space where certainty used to live. And that was exactly what settled over the room after Rachel walked out, her heels striking the floor like punctuation marks on the final sentence of a story none of us had realized we'd been living inside. Jason didn't move. Not immediately, not even after the sound of the doors swinging shut behind her had faded. Not even when someone across the room dropped a spoon and flinched at the sound. He sat in his chair like a man trying to calculate the cost of a mistake. He thought he had cleverly buried beneath layers of charm, good intentions, and selective memory. And what made it worse, what made it almost tragic, was the look on his face. Not of guilt exactly, but of bafflement. Like a child who had been caught but still couldn't understand why everyone was suddenly so upset. My mother, who had spent her entire adult life manufacturing a version of the world in which Jason was always the sun and the rest of us mere satellites dutifully orbiting him, stood behind his chair with one hand clenched in the fabric of her skirt and the other gripping the back of the seat, as if the room might tilt without her holding it steady. And I could almost hear the machinery of her mind whirring as it worked to craft a narrative that would preserve the illusion, to smooth this jagged moment into something digestible, forgivable, erasable. But there are moments that do not want to be rewritten, truths that resist softening, and in that space, between denial and reckoning, the entire family teetered on the edge of something none of them had planned for: accountability. Eventually, people began to stir, slowly at first, gathering coats, murmuring their goodbyes, offering awkward condolences, as if a death had occurred and no one quite knew how to name it. Rachel's parents were the first to leave, their expressions brittle and unreadable, their exit dignified and wordless. And I watched as Rachel's mother paused at the door, glanced back at Jason, and then looked at me, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as though she was trying to determine if I had known. And if so, how much? I didn't smile, I didn't nod. I just looked back at her, unwavering, and in that brief moment, something passed between us. Not camaraderie, but understanding. Dad, true to form, said nothing the entire time, just sat quietly with his elbows on the table and his hands folded, his eyes trained on his empty dessert plate like it might offer him some explanation. And for once, I didn't resent him for his silence. It was the most honest thing he could give us. When the room finally emptied and the cleanup staff began folding chairs with the cautious movements of people who had overheard too much, I remained in my seat, watching Jason from across the room, watching Mom as she leaned in and whispered something to him that I couldn't hear, though I was certain it was a version of the same old lullaby. "You'll get through this, sweetheart. People will forget. She overreacted. We all make mistakes. This isn't who you are." But the thing is, it was exactly who he was. It had always been who he was. And the rest of us had spent so many years pretending otherwise that it took Rachel, a woman who'd only been in our lives for a blink, to finally break the pattern with one recorded voicemail and the courage to press play. I stood only when I was ready, walked past the half-empty wine glasses and discarded napkins, past the abandoned stage and the wilting centerpiece flowers that now looked more funereal than festive. And when I reached Mom and Jason, I didn't hesitate. He looked up at me, eyes hollowed out by humiliation, or perhaps fear, or perhaps the terrifying realization that the scaffolding of privilege he had always assumed would hold him aloft had finally begun to collapse under the weight of truth. "Did you know?" he asked, voice dry, raw, almost childlike. I didn't answer, not because I didn't have one, but because the answer would not have satisfied him, no matter how I phrased it. He didn't want the truth, not really. He wanted an explanation that would restore him to his rightful place at the center of our mother's universe, an excuse that would let him believe this had happened to him, and not because of him. Mom stepped in then, as I knew she would, with a quiet, urgent, "Lena, don't." But I looked at her with the kind of calm I'd earned one cut at a time and said, "You asked me to let him have his moment. I did." And with that, I walked away. Not triumphant, not vindicated, not even angry anymore. Just done. Done with the pretending, the shrinking, the invisible balancing act of being the good daughter who swallowed every insult, every slight, every cruel omission for the sake of peace that was never really mine to keep. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected, the wind carrying with it the soft scent of something blooming nearby, something sweet, sharp, alive. I pulled my coat tighter around me and walked toward my car, phone buzzing in my pocket with a message I didn't bother to check yet, knowing instinctively it was Rachel. And when I did open it later, sitting in my apartment with the lights low and the wine uncorked, her words were short and perfect. "Thank you for the silence." It was louder than anything. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Some stories don't end with an apology, or a reconciliation, or a neat little bow. Some stories end with someone finally leaving the room and never coming back. And some, like mine, end with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, this time, the truth didn't need a hero. It just needed someone to step out of its way.